The spring of 1945 was filled with both triumph and exhaustion. Nazi Germany, which had dominated Europe for 12 years, was collapsing under the combined assault of the Allies. Soviet troops pushed into Berlin from the east, while British and American forces advanced from the west. The dream of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich ended in fire and rubble for the soldiers who planted flags on shattered buildings, for the leaders who read communiques in their war rooms. Victory seemed like the end of an age of darkness. Yet behind the joy, another reality was already forming. The victors did not share the same vision of what the world, and especially Germany, should become. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, approached the final months of war with calculation sharpened by decades of suspicion. Twice in a single generation, German armies had poured across his borders. In 1914, the Kaiser's soldiers marched through Eastern Europe, and in 1941, Hitler's divisions brought devastation deeper than any Russia had ever endured. Entire cities starved, millions perished, whole regions were reduced to ashes. For Stalin, the lesson was simple and brutal. Germany must never again be allowed to rise as a threat. It must be crippled, controlled, and, if possible, remade into a buffer that would protect the Soviet Union for all time. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Britain, viewed the same landscape through a different lens. Britain had fought through 6 years of war, had endured the Blitz, had seen its empire strained to the breaking point. Churchill wanted security as well, but he also wanted balance. A Europe dominated entirely by Moscow was as dangerous to him as a Europe dominated by Berlin had once been. Britain's interest lay in preserving a middle ground, in ensuring that Western Europe remained open to democratic traditions, free trade, and political pluralism. Churchill admired Soviet courage in war, but he distrusted Stalin's motives. To him, the Soviet leader was not a partner of equal trust, but a man driven by iron necessity and ruthless ambition. Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, entered the closing stage of war with yet another perspective. The United States had become the most powerful nation on Earth, its industry unmatched, its homeland untouched by devastation. Roosevelt believed that lasting peace required cooperation, that the mistakes of the First World War must not be repeated. He hoped to build institutions like the United Nations that could bind nations together and reduce the chance of another global conflict. His health was failing, but his vision was expansive. He believed that the alliance of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union could endure into peace. It was in this atmosphere of mixed hopes and hidden fears that the Yalta Conference convened in February of 1945. The three great leaders gathered in the Crimean resort to decide the fate of a Europe still in flames. They sat at a round table, posed for photographs, spoke of unity. Yet each carried his own agenda. Stalin pressed for recognition of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, insisting that friendly governments must be established on his borders. He demanded reparations from Germany, compensation for the unimaginable suffering of his people. Roosevelt sought to secure Soviet entry into the war against Japan, believing that such intervention would shorten the struggle in the Pacific. Churchill argued for free elections, for the right of nations like Poland to determine their own path. The agreements made at Yalta reflected this uneasy balance. Germany would be divided into zones of occupation, controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, with France later granted a share. Berlin, though deep in the Soviet zone, would also be divided among the four powers. The Allies pledged to hold trials for Nazi leaders, to establish a new international organization, and to allow free elections in countries liberated from Hitler's rule. On paper, it seemed a vision of cooperation. In practice, it was fragile, filled with ambiguities that each side interpreted in its own favor. The death of Roosevelt in April brought Harry Truman to the presidency of the United States, and with him a harder edge. Truman was less inclined to trust Stalin, more suspicious of Soviet intentions. When the war in Europe ended in May, the alliance still stood, but cracks widened. By the time of the Potsdam Conference in July, the smiles of Yalta had given way to cold stares. Churchill arrived, soon to be replaced by Clement Attlee after Britain's elections. Stalin exuded confidence, his armies occupying vast territories of Eastern Europe. Truman carried with him a secret, the successful test of an atomic bomb in the deserts of New Mexico. He mentioned it to Stalin as a matter of casual remark. Stalin, who already knew through his spies, responded with calm indifference. The stage was set not for friendship, but for rivalry. The fate of Germany dominated the talks. What reparations should be demanded? What industries dismantled? What political structures built? Stalin insisted on extracting as much as possible, stripping factories and shipping them east. Churchill and Truman warned that such plunder would cripple recovery and breed instability. The Allies could not agree on a single policy. Instead, they administered their zones separately, sowing the seeds of division that would soon harden into permanent borders. To the soldiers who had met on the Elbe, the war had ended in camaraderie. To the leaders at Yalta and Potsdam, it was ending in suspicion. Germany, the heart of Europe, became not only the symbol of Nazi defeat, but the prize of peace. Stalin saw in it a shield for the Soviet Union. Churchill saw in it a danger that could tilt Europe toward communism. Between these visions lay a gulf that would not be bridged. The illusion of alliance, nurtured by necessity in wartime, was fading fast. What remained was calculation, suspicion, and the first steps toward a new conflict that would be fought not with open armies, but with pressure, propaganda, and the shadow of nuclear fire. The division of Germany was not yet permanent, not yet drawn in maps and treaties, but the outlines were already visible. The unity of the Allies was gone. What stood in its place was a fragile coexistence, each side waiting to see how far the other would go. In the rubble of Berlin, in the meeting halls of Yalta and Potsdam, the Cold War was already being born. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in May of 1945, Germany was a nation in ruins. Its cities lay shattered, its population stunned, its institutions obliterated. Into this void stepped the occupying armies of the Allies. What had been discussed in theory at Yalta and later at Potsdam now became reality on the ground. Germany would be administered not as one country, but as a land carved into zones, each shaped by the power that controlled it. In these zones, the future of Europe began to take form. The Soviet zone covered the eastern portion, stretching from the Oder River to the heart of the country. Red Army soldiers patrolled roads and railways, commandeered buildings, and oversaw the dismantling of factories. Entire industrial plants were taken apart piece by piece, loaded onto trains, and shipped to the Soviet Union as reparations. Stalin believed that Germany must pay in machinery as well as in money, and he believed that only a crippled Germany could ensure Soviet safety. At the same time, Soviet authorities began to shape the political landscape, encouraging communists to take leading roles in local governments, merging parties under Moscow's influence, and laying the groundwork for what would become a socialist German state. In the Western zones, administered by Britain, the United States, and later France, a different approach took hold. The devastation was severe there as well, but the policy emphasized stability and eventual recovery. British administrators focused on keeping food moving, preventing famine in the great cities of the Ruhr and the Rhineland. American officers set up councils, encouraged some local autonomy, and cautiously allowed newspapers to reopen. The French, though determined to keep Germany weak, also sought to carve influence in their corner of the country. Each of these policies reflected national interests, but together they contrasted sharply with Soviet methods. Berlin, though deep inside the Soviet zone, was itself divided among the four powers. This division was more than symbolic. The city became a microcosm of the Cold War before the Cold War was named. In the eastern half, Soviet police and administrators promoted socialist restructuring. In the western sectors, British and American officials encouraged political diversity and economic pluralism. The city became a living laboratory of two competing systems, side by side, often at odds. The Allied Control Council was meant to coordinate policy across Germany. Representatives from the four powers sat together in Berlin, issuing decrees and attempting to shape a unified administration. At first, there was cooperation, at least in appearance. Agreements were signed on denazification, on the disbanding of the Wehrmacht, on the prosecution of war criminals. But beneath the formalities, tensions festered. Each side interpreted denazification differently. Each defined democracy differently. Each measured reparations according to its own interests. By 1946, the council was often paralyzed, its meetings filled with arguments and accusations rather than decisions. For ordinary Germans, life under occupation was marked by hunger, displacement, and uncertainty. Millions of refugees poured in from the east, fleeing the advance of the Red Army or expelled from former German territories now under Polish and Czech control. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden lay in ruins, their inhabitants scavenging for food and shelter. In the Soviet zone, strict quotas of grain and coal were extracted to feed Soviet needs. In the Western zones, aid shipments from America and Britain kept many alive, though shortages remained severe. The contrast in conditions was not absolute, but it was visible enough to shape perceptions. To many Germans, the Western zones felt more hopeful, the Eastern more oppressive. Churchill watched these developments with growing alarm. Though he was no longer prime minister after the elections of July 1945, he remained a powerful voice. In March of 1946, he delivered his famous speech in Fulton, Missouri, declaring that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. Behind that curtain, Churchill warned, lay the growing power of Moscow, imposing control over nations that had once been free. The phrase captured the reality taking shape in Germany, where the curtain ran not through distant lands, but through the heart of a defeated nation. Stalin rejected the accusation, insisting that the Soviet Union sought only security after immense sacrifice. Yet the actions in the Soviet zone told another story. Political opposition was stifled, newspapers censored, independent voices silenced. The Socialist Unity Party, formed by merging communists and social democrats under pressure, became the dominant force, loyal to Moscow. Schools were restructured, curricula rewritten, youth organizations modeled after Soviet examples. Bit by bit, Eastern Germany was molded into a system that mirrored the Soviet Union. In the West, meanwhile, British and American authorities encouraged pluralism. Political parties re-emerged. Newspapers voiced diverse opinions, churches resumed influence. The economic policies aimed to restore production, not dismantle it. The contrast grew sharper each year. By the end of 1946, it was clear to many that Germany was no longer one land under temporary occupation, but two lands under rival visions. Berlin magnified these differences. The western sectors, though small in territory, became a showcase of what America and Britain wanted to promote: openness, free exchange, a link to the outside world. The eastern sector became a showcase of Soviet control, with parades, banners, and relentless propaganda extolling socialism. The city was still one in theory, but in daily life it was increasingly split. Tensions simmered in every street, in every tram line that crossed from one sector to another. The illusion that Germany could be jointly governed by the Allies was fading. What remained was suspicion and maneuvering. Stalin viewed the Western policies as attempts to rebuild German strength against him. Churchill, Attlee, and Truman viewed Soviet policies as expansion, not security. Between these perspectives lay a gulf that words could not bridge. Germany, once the cause of the war, had become the prize of peace, and in the contest for that prize, the seeds of division were already rooted deep. The process was subtle at first, marked by administrative decrees and economic policies, yet its direction was clear. A nation that had once stood united under the swastika now stood shattered, its pieces drawn into the orbit of rival empires. The occupation was meant to be temporary, a path to recovery. Instead, it became the foundation of a division that would last for decades. The experiment of joint control was failing. The reality of confrontation was rising. By the late 1940s, the promise of cooperation in Germany had largely collapsed. What had once been spoken of as a joint effort to rebuild a broken nation was now clearly becoming a rivalry, one that defined the shape of Europe for decades to come. At the center of this rivalry was not only the vast territory of Germany itself, but the battered city of Berlin, where every decision became a test of will and every street corner whispered of the future confrontation between East and West. The first cracks appeared in the realm of economics. In the Western zones, Britain and America realized that recovery required more than emergency rations. Factories had to be revived, coal mines reopened, trade restarted. Yet their efforts constantly clashed with Soviet demands for reparations. Each ton of coal sent westward was contested, each shipment of machinery challenged. In 1947, the British and American zones merged into what became known as the Bizone, a practical step to coordinate resources and stabilize administration. The Soviets viewed this as an act of betrayal, a clear sign that the Western powers were moving to consolidate their influence and leave Moscow out. The logic of division fed itself. As the Bizone took shape, efforts to create a functioning currency in the Western territories advanced. Inflation ravaged the German economy, and barter replaced money in much of daily life. The Western powers planned a new currency reform to stabilize trade. Stalin saw this as a direct challenge. Money was not merely economics, it was sovereignty, and the introduction of a new currency in Western Germany meant the beginning of a separate state. Berlin became the immediate flashpoint. The city, still divided into 4 sectors, relied on agreements that allowed Western access through Soviet-controlled territory. When the new Western currency was introduced in June of 1948, Stalin responded with the most dramatic move yet: the Berlin Blockade. Rail lines were cut, roads closed, barges stopped. Western Berlin, home to more than 2 million people, suddenly faced the prospect of strangulation. Stalin believed that by cutting the lifeline, he could force Britain and America to abandon their outpost. What followed was one of the most remarkable operations of the early Cold War: the Berlin Airlift. For nearly a year, American and British aircraft filled the skies, landing every few minutes at Tempelhof and Gatow airports, bringing food, coal, and medicine. Pilots flew in all weather, often at great risk, turning logistics into a symbol of defiance. Children in Berlin watched the planes descend and nicknamed them candy bombers, after some pilots dropped sweets attached to little parachutes. The sight of these aircraft became a lifeline, not only of supplies, but of morale. Stalin had gambled that the West would not endure the strain. Instead, the blockade hardened resolve, convincing even skeptics that cooperation with Moscow was no longer possible. Churchill, though out of office during the blockade, saw in it confirmation of his earlier warnings. To him, the Iron Curtain was no longer a metaphor, but a reality cemented in concrete and air corridors. He argued that firmness, not compromise, was the only answer to Stalin. In the British public, weary from war, there was unease, but the image of Berliners resisting Soviet pressure evoked sympathy. Across the Atlantic, American opinion shifted sharply toward confrontation. The blockade became a lesson that Stalin understood only force and resolve. Within the Soviet zone, the blockade served another purpose. It allowed Soviet authorities to tighten control, portraying the West as aggressors, while justifying the rapid creation of institutions loyal to Moscow. The Socialist Unity Party consolidated its grip, secret police networks expanded, and education was reshaped to reflect socialist ideals. While Berliners in the western sectors ate chocolate from airlift planes, those in the eastern sector were taught loyalty to the Soviet Union as the guardian of peace. The city split not only physically, but in spirit. The blockade ended in May of 1949 when Stalin lifted the restrictions, recognizing that the airlift had beaten his attempt to strangle the Western presence. Yet the consequences of the crisis were profound. The West responded by formalizing their cooperation into the creation of the Federal Republic of Germany, with Bonn as its capital. Almost immediately, the Soviets answered by proclaiming the German Democratic Republic in the east, with Berlin as its contested symbol. What had been 4 zones of occupation became 2 states, 2 systems, 2 futures. This transformation marked the true birth of the Cold War in Europe. Germany was no longer a defeated nation waiting for reconstruction, but a battlefield of ideologies. Every policy, from trade agreements to cultural exchanges, carried the weight of that division. For Churchill and his successors, the priority was to anchor Western Germany firmly in the democratic camp, integrated into the Atlantic Alliance. For Stalin, Eastern Germany was a shield and a showcase, a demonstration that socialism could rise from the ruins of fascism. Berlin remained at the heart of the struggle. Even after the blockade ended, the memory of those months lingered like a scar. Western Berlin became a symbol of resistance, a city that survived because the West refused to abandon it. Eastern Berlin became the capital of a new socialist state, but always with the uneasy knowledge that only a few streets away lay another world. Families were divided, friendships strained, every crossing point watched by soldiers. It was in Berlin that the Cold War took on its human face, visible in the daily lives of those who lived under the shadow of rival flags. For Stalin, the division was a victory of necessity. He had secured an Eastern German state loyal to Moscow, ensuring a buffer against future invasion. For Churchill and the West, it was a warning that the Soviet Union would not retreat voluntarily, but would press its advantage wherever possible. Both sides now accepted that cooperation had failed. The wartime alliance had not survived peace. By the close of 1949, the division of Germany was irreversible. The dream of unity under Allied administration was gone, replaced by the stark reality of confrontation. The seeds planted in Yalta and Potsdam had grown into rival states. The illusion of friendship had dissolved into suspicion. And Berlin, once the proud capital of a united empire, was now a frontline city, embodying the division of an entire continent. The closing years of the 1940s and the dawn of the 1950s marked the moment when the division of Germany ceased to be an arrangement of occupation and became a lasting reality. What had begun as temporary zones intended to manage the ruins of the Third Reich hardened into permanent states, each armed with an ideology and backed by rival powers. The relationship between Stalin and Churchill, which had once carried the veneer of partnership, was now remembered only as a fleeting interlude before the inevitable collision of interests. The Western creation of the Federal Republic of Germany in September of 1949 set a definitive boundary. The new state, headquartered in Bonn, represented not only an administrative structure, but also a declaration that Western Germany belonged firmly to the Atlantic world. It was not merely a geographic division, it was a moral and political statement. In the Eastern Zone, Stalin responded swiftly by establishing the German Democratic Republic only a few weeks later. The capital in East Berlin became a showcase of socialism, but its position inside the Soviet zone made it both vulnerable and symbolic. What had once been the center of a single nation was now the most contested city on earth. For Churchill, though out of office when these transformations occurred, the meaning was clear. He had warned as early as 1946 in his famous speech about an iron curtain stretching across Europe. Now the metaphor had taken the shape of actual institutions, borders, and armies. He saw Germany not as the end of the struggle, but as the beginning of a larger confrontation. To him, the lesson of the blockade and the division was that Stalin respected only strength. That conviction influenced British strategy and American policy alike. The Atlantic Alliance, crystallized in the formation of NATO in 1949, was in part a direct answer to the division of Germany. For Stalin, the creation of the Eastern German state was not merely a concession to division, but a triumph of control. He had secured a buffer, a loyal socialist republic on the very frontier with the West. Eastern Germany could be shaped as both a shield and a model, a state reconstructed in the image of Soviet socialism. The suppression of independent parties, the integration of the Socialist Unity Party, the control of the economy and the press, all served to ensure that this new Germany would not drift westward. In Stalin's mind, the sacrifice of wartime losses demanded security, and security meant dominance. The people of Germany, however, found themselves caught between these grand designs. Families separated by occupation zones discovered that what had seemed temporary became permanent. Train journeys once routine required permits. Letters were censored, phone calls monitored. A student in Leipzig could no longer easily study in Heidelberg. A businessman in Hamburg no longer traded with Dresden. The wound of partition cut through daily life, reminding everyone that Germany was now two nations. Berlin embodied that wound more visibly than any other place. Even without the concrete wall that would later scar its landscape, the city was already divided in spirit and in governance. Western sectors, sustained by airlifts and Allied support, developed into a beacon of democratic resilience. Eastern Berlin, with Soviet parades and socialist slogans, declared itself the capital of a workers' state. Each side staged cultural displays, festivals, and propaganda to show the superiority of its vision. The city became a stage on which the world watched the Cold War unfold. Internationally, the division of Germany carried immense consequences. For the United States and Britain, the creation of a stable Western German state was essential to European recovery. The Marshall Plan, launched to rebuild Europe, flowed through Western Germany, binding it to Western economies. Factories in the Ruhr, once dismantled as reparations, now became engines of recovery. West German currency stabilized, trade resumed, and prosperity gradually returned. For Stalin, this was confirmation of his suspicions. The West was using Germany as a fortress against socialism. In response, he tightened control in the East, ensuring that its resources fed the Soviet system and its loyalty remained unquestioned. The ideological conflict crystallized in military terms. NATO in the West and the Soviet-led Cominform in the East solidified the division not only politically, but strategically. German soil, once the heart of Europe, became a front line in a global standoff. Every maneuver, every troop deployment, every political speech echoed with the awareness that Germany was no longer a question of reconstruction, but a battlefield in waiting. For Churchill personally, the partition confirmed both his foresight and his frustration. He had foreseen Soviet expansion and urged unity among the Western democracies, yet he also regretted that Europe had become so starkly divided. His call for a United States of Europe, though visionary, remained distant, overshadowed by the rivalry of superpowers. The division of Germany symbolized both the necessity of Western solidarity and the failure of post-war hopes for a common peace. Stalin, on the other hand, regarded the outcome as a necessary defense of Soviet security. To him, the devastation of the Soviet Union in the war justified uncompromising measures. A divided Germany meant that no single hostile state could rise again to threaten Russia's survival. But Stalin's pursuit of security through domination created the very hostility he feared. By transforming Eastern Germany into a satellite, he ensured that the West would never trust his intentions. By the early 1950s, the division of Germany was no longer an unresolved post-war arrangement, but a cornerstone of the Cold War. The border between East and West became a line of tanks and barbed wire, a place where rival systems stared at each other across no man's land. For the people of Germany, the dream of unity seemed ever more remote. Children grew up in two different schools, taught two different histories, pledging allegiance to two different futures. The legacy of Stalin and Churchill in this story is paradoxical. Churchill, the wartime ally of Stalin, became the prophet of confrontation, warning that cooperation had died. Stalin, the victor who bore unimaginable losses, secured his sphere but at the cost of perpetual hostility. Together, though unwilling partners, they shaped the fate of Germany not by agreement, but by rivalry. The division of Germany did not end with their lifetimes. It endured for decades, defining the structure of Europe and the psychology of the Cold War. The wall that would one day rise in Berlin was built upon the foundations laid in those first years after victory. The illusion of Allied unity, the ambitions of statesmen, the calculations of security and ideology all converged to create a divided nation. As history unfolded, it became clear that the division of Germany was not merely a consequence of the Second World War, but the opening chapter of the Cold War itself. It was in those years, through the decisions of Stalin and Churchill, that the map of Europe was redrawn. Germany ceased to be a defeated enemy and became the very heart of the global confrontation. And so the story closes not with unity restored, but with division cemented. Stalin and Churchill, each in pursuit of his own vision, had helped to carve a line across Europe. In that line lay the destiny of millions, the fate of nations, and the shadow of a conflict that would define the 20th century. Subscribe us. We don't say goodbye.